Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and you're listening to the Web Dev 101 podcast. This episode I want to do is talk about rendering. Okay, client-side rendering, server-side rendering, static pre-rendering. What are these, and why would you do one versus the other? Funny thing is that we've kind of gone through all these phases where, like, one was sort of the way, and now we're kind of moving towards this world where you kind of need all three because they all serve different purposes. So let's just kind of give you the history. So when the internet first started, everything was pretty much statically rendered, meaning you just wrote static HTML, maybe some CSS. Again, it was one time when you do your styling in your HTML. I don't know if you remember, like bold tags and I tags for italics and all that. But basically, what happens is you would just create your HTML CSS and it would just be rendered. Like the HTML was just there. Okay, and that's like the quickest way for a page to load. That's why it was the way it was done. We're talking about, dial-up modems. And with that, we wanted to have more dynamic sites, but you only wanted to ship so much over the web because again, the internet wasn't as fast as it is today. Client-side computers weren't as fast as they are today. Browsers weren't as sophisticated as they were today. So the conclusion was maybe we should have more done, but not on the client side, but on the server side. So with languages like Perl, PHP, you started having what's called server-side rendering, where certain aspects of the HTML were not pre-written. Like you didn't pre-write your HTML. You would use templating libraries. Like PHP literally had templating built into it. And you would, inject variables and programming logic into sort of HTML templates. And then every time you would make a request for that website, that template would render the final HTML. So it would pull data from the database, stick them in the placeholders, and then send out sort of the finished page. So if you ever use like WordPress, this is exactly what happens. Every time you pull down a particular post from your blog, it pulls that blog post out of the database, injects it into a WordPress theme template, renders the HTML, and sends down the HTML for that page down to the client. And this is cool. Couple problems is you have to wait for the server to render the page. So there's like a little bit of latency there. Like there's a little bit extra time you have to kind of wait for that page to be rendered. And two, the more burden on the server, which, when you're taking lots and lots of requests, means scaling issues. But allows you to kind of have dynamic information, up-to-date information that updates. Instead of you having to like edit the HTML file, re-upload the HTML file via FTP as you would once upon a time. Eventually computers got faster and JavaScript got more sophisticated and people started doing what was called client-side rendering, where they were doing much more of the burden of all the dynamic stuff on the front end, on the client. This is where React, Angular, Vue, Svelte come in. So instead of you creating a template that a server renders, essentially you use React, Vue. It's still kind of template-y, but really the template's being rendered through components in the browser. And you, instead of pulling data directly from the database, you're making API calls to your backend server to get the data, and then React, Angular, Vue then takes that data and renders your components. And this is great because essentially you would just download the full site up front, so it made for a super blazing fast client-side experience. And that just sort of much better feeling UI. The downside is that technically your website is really just oftentimes a HTML file with one div, and then you bootstrap your app component to that div. But when you're doing search engines generally used to, and this is improving, but search engines would only look at like your HTML file and kind of derive everything from there, because it's just trying to assess the content. But since your content is being dynamically injected via the JavaScript, none of your content was there. And that would make doing single page applications painful for the purposes of search engine optimization. And then we get to kind of the next step. What happens is that they come up with a static site generation. So you're like, wait, I thought we said static sites where we started. Yes, but before you used to have to write your HTML files. Now with static site generators like Gatsby for React, like Gridsome for Vue, Scully for Angular, or Sapper for Svelte, or Jungle.js, or Elder.js for Svelte. Svelte has a few of them. What you can do is that you write all the code in your favorite framework, so you Svelte, Angular, whatever, and what it does is that it reads your website and then just generates the static HTML and CSS for that page, and you would just upload it and serve it like a static page, but you can create all that programming logic into it. And instead of making the API calls when you visit the site, it would make the API calls when you run the build. And the beauty of this is you could automate like a daily build. You can say, okay, hey, rebuild the site once a day, so that way it updates the data. Still not perfect, because what if you have like a user page where the user's data is constantly changing? So a daily render wouldn't necessarily like cut it. And this is where the sort of isomorphic sort of all rendering in one type frameworks come into play. This is like Next.js for React, Nux for Vue, well, Angular kind of has that already built in. And for Svelte, technically Sapper would fill that role too. Although again, Sapper has been discontinued, and they're kind of not necessarily like it's not done. They're just kind of rebuilding it, and they're gonna have it's gonna have a different name. So they're no longer continuing the code base that was the original sort of Sapper framework, which I talked about in a previous episode and in a blog post over there at alexmercedcoder.com. Sorry for the sirens in the background. I do live in Brooklyn, and that's just part of New York City life. But in these frameworks, you could do all three. Okay, you can write the code in a way that certain parts of your website are client-side rendered. Other parts are server-side rendered, and other parts are static rendered. So you have all three available to you. You just have to follow certain conventions in how you write your different parts of your website, which is pretty cool, because then you can really kind of optimize your website and basically do the different parts of the website in the way that's optimal for what you're trying to do. Now, you could have done this before, theoretically. Like, you could use like Express, set up a static folder, and that static folder would have like static HTML files, and you can write a JavaScript file in there with some React code in it, and that would do some client-side rendering stuff. And then you could use like a templating library like EJS to do, like, you could do this, but you were like mixing and matching a bunch of different pieces to do it. So you'd have to kind of think through, like, okay, EJS I'm going to use to like server-side render things I want to have server-side rendered, and then I got to think, okay, this JavaScript file gets pulled in, and I want to render any components that I want rendered from there, and so forth and so forth. So it wasn't necessarily as like intuitive, or like there wasn't really necessarily as like any kind of conventional systemic way of doing it. You just kind of had to know how all these pieces fit together. So that's what's really exciting about this, because you can have certain parts statically rendered to optimize your search engine optimization. You can make sure that the parts that need to be dynamic are server-side rendered, and for all else, keep the rest client-side rendered. And you end up shipping something that kind of mixes those three things. So that's basically just kind of wanted to introduce those concepts, and so you understand what they are and why they matter. So regardless of what framework is your framework, like learning how to do static and server-side rendering in your framework of choice is probably a useful thing to learn. Whether it's Angular, Svelte, Vue, React, learning how to do server-side rendering and static site generation in that framework with those tools is probably like sort of your next step once you kind of conquer sort of that core front-end single-page application building style. But my name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. I've put out a lot of new videos over there on the YouTube channel, a lot of new blog posts over there on the blog post, so you can just head over to alexmercedcoder.com, find it all. Make sure to also head over to devnursery.com and join the Slack and Discord communities. Feel free to message me on there anytime. And yeah, you'll hear from me soon.